Welcome back to the most terrifying chapter of my life. I'm Carol Hawthorne, and if you've been following this story, you know that my daughter Emma married a man who orchestrated their entire romance to steal my family's fortune. Well, today, I'm going to tell you about the day that prediction almost came true. The day David Sterling walked into my home with a notary public and tried to steal everything I owned, legally, methodically, and right in front of my daughter. If you haven't subscribed yet, please ensure to do so now, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why I started recording all of David's conversations and why I sleep with a lawyer on speed dial. The 3 days after Emma's wedding were the longest 72 hours of my life. David had moved into the manor, into what had been Richard's study, claiming he needed office space to manage family affairs. Within hours of returning from their brief honeymoon in the Hamptons, he had rearranged the furniture, installed his own computer system, and was going through filing cabinets like he owned the place. Which, I was beginning to realize, he thought he did. Emma was glowing with newlywed bliss, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was systematically taking inventory of everything we owned. She'd find him in different rooms, the wine cellar with a notepad, the library photographing first edition books, the garage examining Richard's vintage car collection, and she'd just smile and say, "David's so interested in everything. He wants to learn about all of Daddy's hobbies." But I knew better. David wasn't learning about hobbies. He was creating an asset list. Thomas had become a ghost, avoiding me completely and jumping every time David spoke to him. Our loyal estate manager, who used to greet me with coffee and updates about the grounds, now scurried away whenever he saw me coming. The guilt was eating him alive, but whatever David had on him was keeping him silent. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Tuesday morning, exactly 3 days after the wedding, I was in the breakfast room reading the Wall Street Journal when I heard the front door open. No knock, no announcement. Just the sound of someone walking into my house like they belonged there. "Carol?" David's voice echoed through the foyer. "We need to discuss some important business matters." I looked up from my paper to see David striding into the breakfast room, followed by a thin, nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit carrying a leather briefcase. "David, what's going on?" "This is Robert Klein, a notary public. We have some routine paperwork to take care of. Just updating your accounts and property records to include Emma as your married daughter. Standard stuff, really, but it needs to be done for tax and legal purposes." I set down my coffee cup, my hand surprisingly steady despite the ice water suddenly flowing through my veins. I wasn't expecting any paperwork today. David's smile was still charming, but his eyes had gone cold. "I know it seems sudden, but Robert had a cancellation and could fit us in. These documents really should have been filed immediately after the wedding. We're actually cutting it close on some tax deadlines." Robert Klein nodded eagerly, pulling out a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. "Mrs. Hawthorne, these are just routine spousal additions and account updates, very standard for wealthy families when there's a marriage." I stood up slowly, every instinct screaming danger. "I'd prefer to have my attorney review anything before I sign." "Of course," David said smoothly, but something flickered across his face. "But Victoria's in Europe on vacation, isn't she? And these really can't wait, and that the IRS gets very particular about filing deadlines." How did he know Victoria was in Europe? I hadn't told him about her vacation. Hell, I hadn't told anyone except Thomas. "Emma." David called toward the stairs. "Could you come down here for a minute?" My daughter appeared moments later, still in her silk robe, looking confused but happy. "What's all this about?" "Just some boring legal stuff, sweetheart. Adding you to various family accounts now that we're married, but your mother seems hesitant to trust our marriage." The way he said it, the wounded tone, the carefully chosen words, it was masterful manipulation. Emma's face immediately clouded with concern. "Mom, what's wrong? Why wouldn't you want to add me to the accounts? I'm your daughter." "Emma, sweetheart, it's not about trust. It's about being careful with legal documents. Your father always said—" "Your father's gone, Carol," David interrupted, his voice just sharp enough to cut. "And Emma's my wife now. She has legal rights to family assets, and frankly, it's unusual that they haven't been formalized already." Robert Klein was nodding along like a bobblehead. Mrs. Hawthorne, these are really just formalities. Account additions, signature cards, standard beneficiary updates, nothing that changes ownership. But I'd been in business long enough to know that standard documents in the hands of criminals were never standard. And as I glanced at the papers spread across my breakfast table, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. These weren't account signature cards. The letterhead said property transfer documentation and power of attorney designations. Robert, I said carefully, could you explain exactly what each of these documents does? The notary shifted uncomfortably and looked at David, who stepped smoothly into the conversation. The first set adds Emma to all your bank accounts and investment portfolios. The second gives me limited power of attorney to help manage the estate's day-to-day operations, just the boring stuff like paying bills and handling maintenance. The third transfers the house deed to joint ownership between you and Emma, which protects it from estate taxes when you, well, eventually. Emma beamed. See, Mom? David's thinking about protecting our family's future. But I was looking at the fine print, and what I saw there made me physically nauseous. The limited power of attorney wasn't limited at all. It gave David complete control over all financial decisions, medical decisions, and property management. The house deed transfer didn't make Emma a joint owner. It made David the primary owner with something called survivorship rights. And buried in the account documents was language that would give David immediate access to every penny Richard and I had ever earned. These documents, I said slowly, aren't what you're describing, David. His mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. I'm sorry? This power of attorney gives you control over everything. This house deed makes you the primary owner. These aren't spousal additions, they're complete asset transfers. Emma looked confused. David, what's Mom talking about? Robert Klein was sweating now. Mrs. Hawthorne, I think there might be some confusion about the legal terminology. I'm not confused, I said, standing up. I'm looking at documents that would transfer ownership of everything I own to a man I've known for 9 months, and I'm wondering why a routine spousal addition requires a notary to make an emergency house call on a Tuesday morning with papers that were obviously prepared weeks ago. The silence in that breakfast room was deafening. David's charming smile finally disappeared completely. Carol, he said, his voice now cold as winter, I think you're being unnecessarily suspicious and, frankly, a little paranoid. Emma's my wife. We're family now. These documents just formalize what's already true, that I'm here to take care of you both. Take care of us or take care of our assets? Emma was looking back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match. I don't understand what's happening here. David reached over and took Emma's hand. Your mother doesn't trust our marriage, sweetheart. She thinks I'm some kind of gold digger who's trying to steal from the family. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Mom, how could you think that? David loves me. He loves us. And there it was, the manipulation I'd been dreading. David was using my daughter's emotions as a weapon against me. Emma, I said carefully, this isn't about love. This is about legal documents that would give David control over everything your father and I built. Documents that were prepared before you were even engaged. That's ridiculous, David snapped. Robert, tell her these are standard forms. But Robert Klein was looking like he wanted to crawl under the table. They're customized documents, yes, but... Customized how? I pressed. Mrs. Hawthorne, David said, his voice now openly threatening. You're being unreasonable. These documents need to be signed today. The tax implications of delay could cost the family hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then we'll pay the penalties and do this properly, with my attorney present. That's when David showed me who he really was. David stood up, his composure completely gone. Carol, I've been patient with you. I've been understanding about your difficulties accepting Emma's marriage, but this stops now. My difficulties? Yes, your erratic behavior, your paranoia, your inability to accept that things have changed. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through what looked like photos. I've been documenting concerning incidents, your confusion about business matters, your irrational suspicion of family members, your increasing isolation and hostility. My blood turned to ice. What are you talking about? I'm talking about a pattern of behavior that suggests you may not be competent to manage complex financial affairs anymore. Emma's noticed it too, haven't you, sweetheart? Emma looked stricken. David, I never said. You mentioned your mother's been forgetful, having trouble with names and dates, making odd financial decisions. His voice was gentle, concerned, completely false. These are early signs of cognitive decline, and frankly, it would be irresponsible of me as your son-in-law not to ensure proper safeguards are in place. The room started spinning. He was threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent. You bastard, I whispered. Emma gasped. Mom, no, Emma, listen to me. David is threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent so he can steal everything we own. This isn't about protecting the family, it's about destroying it. David's expression was pure cold calculation now. Carol, you're proving my point. These outbursts, these wild accusations, they're not normal. Robert, I think we need to document this incident. Robert Klein was frantically packing up his papers. Mr. Sterling, I think maybe we should postpone. We're not postponing anything, David snapped. Carol, you have two choices. You can sign these documents and maintain your dignity, or I can file for guardianship proceedings and have a court decide whether you're competent to manage your own affairs. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Emma was crying now, completely overwhelmed. Robert Klein looked like he wanted to disappear. And David stood there with the cold confidence of someone who thought he held all the cards. But here's what David didn't know about me. What he couldn't have known, because he'd only seen the grieving widow, the protective mother, the woman who wanted her daughter to be happy. He'd never seen the woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar business from nothing. The woman who'd negotiated with developers and lawyers and city planners for 30 years. The woman who'd learned to survive in a world that tried to dismiss her at every turn. David, I said, my voice deadly quiet, you made one crucial mistake. What's that, Carol? You assumed I was helpless. I reached into the drawer of the breakfast room sideboard and pulled out a small digital recorder. This conversation has been recorded. Every word, every threat, every admission of your plan to steal my assets and have me declared incompetent. David's face went white. You can't. I can, and I did. And Robert? I looked at the terrified notary. I'm curious to know how much David paid you to bring fraudulent documents to my home and participate in what the law calls elder abuse and extortion. Robert Klein was already backing toward the door. I don't know what you're talking about. I was just asked to notarize some documents. Documents that transfer millions of dollars in assets based on false pretenses. That makes you an accessory to fraud. Emma was staring at David like she'd never seen him before. David, what's she talking about? What documents? What threats? And for the first time since I'd met him, David Sterling looked genuinely afraid. But my victory was short-lived, because David quickly regained his composure. Carol, you're making a serious mistake. You think you're protecting your family, but you're actually endangering them. What do you mean? David smiled, and it was the most chilling expression I'd ever seen. I mean that you're not the only one who knows how to gather information. Did you really think I didn't know about the private investigator you hired? Did you think I didn't know about your conversations with Victoria? Your late-night calls to family friends asking about my background? My heart sank. He'd been monitoring my communications. Here's what's going to happen, David continued. You're going to sign those documents, or I'm going to make some phone calls of my own. Calls to the IRS about some irregularities in your tax filings from 2019. Calls to the state attorney general about some questionable business practices in the Fairfield Development Project. Calls to Emma's employer about her mother's deteriorating mental condition. Emma looked horrified. David, stop. Just stop. But David was on a roll now, his true nature fully revealed. You see, Carol, I've been planning this for a lot longer than you think. And I have information that could destroy not just you, but Emma's career, Thomas's immigration status, and several of your business associates who trusted you with sensitive information. The magnitude of his preparation, his ruthlessness, his complete lack of conscience, it was breathtaking in its evil. So, David said, straightening his tie, shall we try this again? Robert, please prepare the documents for signature. I stood there in my own breakfast room, surrounded by the life Richard and I had built, staring at the man who was systematically destroying everything we'd worked for. Emma was crying. Robert Klein was trembling, and David was waiting with the patience of a spider who'd finally trapped his prey. Sign the documents and lose everything. Refuse to sign and watch him destroy my daughter's life along with my own. It was the perfect trap. Elegant, comprehensive, and seemingly inescapable. Almost. Because what David didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that while he'd been gathering information about me, I'd been gathering information about him too. David, I said quietly, before I make my decision, I have just one question for you. What's that, Carol? How long have you been Daniel Sorensen? The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. Emma looked confused. Who's Daniel Sorensen? David's composure cracked completely. I don't know what you're talking about. Really? Because I have a very interesting report from my private investigator about a man named Daniel Sorensen who's been running inheritance scams for the past 15 years. A man who's been married 6 times to wealthy women who all mysteriously signed over their assets shortly after the wedding. 3 of whom died under suspicious circumstances. Robert Klein dropped his briefcase. Emma's face went white. David, what is she talking about? I'm talking about the fact that your husband's real name is Daniel Sorensen. He's wanted by the FBI for fraud and elder abuse, and Patricia Sterling isn't his aunt, she's his partner in crime. David's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, and for a terrifying moment I wondered if I'd pushed too far. But then Emma spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Is it true? Is any of this true? And David Sterling, or Daniel Sorensen, looked at the woman he'd manipulated and deceived, the woman who'd trusted him with her heart and her future, and said the words that would haunt me forever. Emma, sweetheart, you have no idea how naive you really are. 2 weeks after Daniel, I refused to call him David anymore, tried to force me to sign those fraudulent documents. I sat in Victoria Blackwood's law office, staring at a file that would change everything. Victoria has been my attorney for 20 years. She's sharp as a blade, tougher than nails, and one of the few people in this world I trust completely. When I called her from London, where she was supposedly on vacation, and told her what was happening, she cut her trip short and flew back immediately. Carol, she said, sliding the thick manila folder across her mahogany desk, you're not going to believe what Johnson found. Johnson was the private investigator I'd hired after that first dinner with Daniel. What I hadn't told Emma, what I hadn't told anyone, was that his report had actually arrived 3 days before the wedding. 3 days. I had known exactly who Daniel Sorensen was when I walked my daughter down the aisle. I had known about his criminal past, his previous victims, his entire elaborate scheme, and I had let Emma marry him anyway. His real name is Daniel Marcus Sorensen. Victoria began, opening the file to reveal photographs, court documents, and FBI wanted notices. 32 years old, just like he claimed, but everything else was a lie. He's been running inheritance scams for 15 years, targeting wealthy widows and their children. The photographs showed a man I recognized but had never truly seen. Daniel at his first arrest in 2009. Daniel at his second arrest in 2012. Daniel walking out of prison in 2018 after serving time for elder abuse and fraud. He's been married 6 times, Carol. 6 times to women whose families lost everything. 3 of those women died under suspicious circumstances after signing over their assets. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the pages. Carol Santos, 64, fell downstairs 2 weeks after transferring her Napa Valley vineyard. Helen Richardson, 59, died of a sudden heart attack the day after signing over her Boston real estate empire. Patricia Williams, 61, overdosed on prescription medication 3 months after losing her family's pharmaceutical fortune. Patricia Sterling isn't his aunt, Victoria continued. Her real name is Patricia Walsh. She's a disbarred attorney who's been his accomplice since 2011. They've perfected this scheme. He handles the emotional manipulation. She handles the legal framework. They've stolen over $40 million from families across the country. But the worst part was still coming. Carol, they're not working alone. This is part of a larger criminal network that specifically targets wealthy widows with adult children. They have researchers who identify potential victims, background specialists who create false identities, and legal experts who design the fraudulent documents. Victoria pulled out an organizational chart that looked like something from an FBI investigation. They call themselves Legacy Acquisitions. They have 43 active operatives working in 12 states, and they've successfully completed over 200 scams in the past decade. I stared at the chart, seeing names, photographs, and dollar amounts that made me physically sick. Families destroyed, legacies stolen, lives ended. How do they choose their targets, I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Widows with substantial estates, adult children who aren't involved in the family business, and some kind of emotional vulnerability, grief, loneliness, recent loss. You fit their profile perfectly after Richard died. That's when she told me the part that broke my heart. Carol, they'd been watching your family for almost 2 years. The art gallery where Daniel met Emma? They rented space there for 6 months, studying her schedule, her preferences, her personality. Emma never had a chance. So why didn't you stop the wedding? Victoria asked. Why did you let Emma marry him when you knew he was a criminal? I took a deep breath, preparing to admit the most terrifying gamble I'd ever taken. Because stopping the wedding wouldn't have stopped him. He would have disappeared, found another victim, and continued destroying families. And Emma would have spent the rest of her life believing I had destroyed her chance at happiness. I stood up and walked to Victoria's window, looking out at the city where my daughter was probably having lunch with a man who wanted her dead. But mostly, I continued, because Johnson's investigation revealed something that the FBI had been trying to prove for years. Daniel and Patricia have been incredibly careful never to leave evidence that could support federal charges. All their previous victims either died or were too traumatized and financially ruined to testify effectively. Victoria understood immediately. You wanted to catch them in the act. I wanted to bury them. Not just Daniel, not just Patricia, but the entire network. And the only way to do that was to let them think they were succeeding, while we gathered irrefutable evidence of their crimes. So what's the plan? Victoria asked. We're going to give them exactly what they want. I'm going to call Daniel and tell him I've decided to sign the documents. We'll set up a meeting here in your office, supposedly for me to transfer my assets to him. Victoria looked concerned. Carol, that's incredibly dangerous. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong because the FBI will be listening to every word. Agent Rodriguez, from the Financial Crimes Division, has been building a case against Legacy Acquisitions for 3 years. He just needed someone willing to be bait. I pulled out my phone and showed Victoria the recording app I'd been using to document every conversation with Daniel. I've been gathering evidence for 2 weeks. Phone calls, text messages, witness statements from Thomas about the blackmail, financial records showing their previous crimes. Agent Rodriguez says we have enough to arrest the entire network. That afternoon, I made the phone call that would end this nightmare. Daniel, it's Carol. I've been thinking about what you said, about protecting the family's future, and I think you're right. I'd like to sign those documents. There was a pause, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. I'm so glad you've come to your senses, Carol. This is really for the best. Can we meet tomorrow at Victoria's office? I want to make sure everything is done properly. Of course. Patricia and I will be there at 2 o'clock. And Carol? I think you're making a very wise decision. After I hung up, I sat in my car outside Victoria's office and cried. Not from fear or sadness, but from rage. Rage at the thought of all the families they'd destroyed, all the lives they'd ended, all the trust they'd shattered, but mostly rage at what they had done to my daughter. The next day, Daniel and Patricia walked into Victoria's conference room looking like they'd already won. Daniel was impeccably dressed as always, carrying himself with that confident charm that had fooled my daughter. Patricia wore a severe black suit and carried a briefcase full of what I now knew were completely fraudulent documents. Carol? Daniel said, kissing my cheek like a loving son-in-law. I'm so proud of you for making this decision. Emma's going to be thrilled that we can finally move forward as a family. Emma. They had convinced her to come to the meeting, telling her it was just a formality, that her mother was finally accepting their marriage. She sat beside Daniel, holding his hand, completely unaware that she was about to watch her husband get arrested. "Before we begin," I said, "I have something I'd like to share with both of you." I reached into my purse and pulled out Johnson's investigation file. "I know who you really are, Daniel. Or should I call you Daniel Sorensen?" The change in the room was instantaneous. Daniel's charming mask slipped completely, and Patricia's hand moved instinctively toward her briefcase, like she was reaching for a weapon. "I know about Carol Santos and Helen Richardson and Patricia Williams. I know about legacy acquisitions and your network of predators. I know about the blackmail scheme against Thomas, and I know about your plan to have me declared mentally incompetent after stealing my assets." Emma was staring at me in shock. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that your husband is a convicted criminal who has murdered at least 3 women and stolen millions of dollars from families just like ours." That's when Agent Rodriguez and 6 other federal agents walked through the conference room door. "Daniel Sorensen," Agent Rodriguez announced, "you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, elder abuse, and murder." The next few minutes were chaos. Daniel tried to run and was tackled by 2 agents. Patricia attempted to destroy documents and was restrained before she could reach her briefcase. Emma was screaming, crying, trying to understand how her perfect marriage had become a federal crime scene. But the moment that will stay with me forever was when Daniel, handcuffed and facing life in prison, looked at me with pure hatred and said, "You stupid old woman. You have no idea what you've done." "Actually," I replied, "I know exactly what I've done. I've saved my daughter's life." As the FBI agents led Daniel and Patricia away, Thomas appeared in the conference room doorway. Our loyal estate manager, who I'd suspected of betrayal, was actually the person who had helped save us all. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry." They had photographs of my immigration paperwork, records that showed some irregularities from 20 years ago. They threatened to have me deported, to separate me from my family. "Thomas," I said, "what did you really do?" I gave them basic information at first, just business details that were already public. But when I realized what they were planning, when I understood they meant to hurt you and Miss Emma, I started feeding them false information. And I began recording all of our conversations. Thomas pulled out a small recording device. Everything they asked me to do, everything they threatened, every detail of their plan, it's all here. Agent Rodriguez says it's enough to convict the entire network. The hardest part was watching Emma process the truth about her marriage. "Mom," she's through her tears. "How long have you known?" "Since 3 days before your wedding." "And you let me marry him anyway?" I took her hands in mine. "Emma, sweetheart, if I had stopped the wedding, you would have spent the rest of your life thinking I was a controlling mother who destroyed your happiness. Daniel would have disappeared and found another victim, and dozens of other families would have suffered the same fate as ours." "But what if he had hurt you? What if his plan had worked?" "Then I would have died, knowing I had protected you and saved other families from the same fate. That's what mothers do, Emma. We take risks our children can't understand because we love them more than we love ourselves." But there was one more truth I needed to share. "Emma, there's something else. Something I haven't told anyone, not even Victoria." I reached into my purse and pulled out a letter from Richard's safety deposit box. "Your father left this for me, to be opened only if I ever felt our family was in serious danger. He had his own suspicions about people who might target us, and he left detailed instructions for how to protect ourselves." Emma read the letter, and her eyes filled with fresh tears. Richard had anticipated exactly this kind of threat. He had set up secret bank accounts, hired security consultants, and even identified trusted law enforcement contacts who could help if needed. "Daddy knew this could happen? Your father was a brilliant man who understood that wealth makes you a target. Everything I did, hiring the private investigator, working with the FBI, even letting you marry Daniel, it was all following a plan your father created to protect us." 6 months later, Daniel Sorensen was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Patricia Walsh received 30 years. The entire legacy acquisitions network was dismantled. with 43 arrests across 12 states. Emma's marriage was annulled due to fraud, and she began therapy to process the trauma of discovering that her perfect love story was actually a carefully orchestrated crime. Thomas remained with our family, and we helped him resolve his immigration issues legally. He's now head of security for Hawthorne Estate Management, the new company we created to help other families protect themselves from similar threats. And me? I learned that sometimes protecting the people you love means making decisions that seem cruel, dangerous, or unforgivable. But I also learned that a mother's love, combined with careful planning and the right allies, can bring down even the most sophisticated criminal network. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: trust your instincts. When someone seems too perfect, too charming, too interested in your family's private business, investigate. When someone pressures you to sign documents quickly, without legal review, refuse. When someone tries to isolate you from your support network or make you doubt your own judgment, fight back. But most importantly, never underestimate the power of a family that stands together. Emma and I are closer now than we've ever been. She works with me in the business, and she's become an advocate for elder abuse prevention. She speaks at conferences, sharing her story to help other young people recognize the warning signs of manipulation. The Hawthorne estate remains secure, and we've used our resources to fund a foundation that provides legal assistance to families targeted by inheritance scams. And every night, when I say my prayers, I thank Richard for his wisdom, Emma for her forgiveness, and the FBI for their patience in letting an old woman help them catch some very dangerous criminals. Because sometimes the best way to protect your family isn't to shield them from danger. Sometimes it's to walk straight into that danger together, with your eyes wide open and your evidence carefully documented. Thank you for following this incredible, terrifying, and ultimately triumphant journey with me. If this story has taught you something about protecting your family, recognizing manipulation, or trusting your instincts, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Elder abuse and inheritance fraud are growing problems that affect thousands of families every year. By sharing stories like mine, we can help others recognize the warning signs and protect themselves before it's too late. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more true stories about family protection, legal awareness, and the power of standing up to those who would exploit our most vulnerable moments. And remember, you are stronger than you think, smarter than they assume, and more protected than you know. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps you protect yours.